So let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Kate McCarthy will start us off. Kate is professor of comparative religion at California State University, Chico, where she also serves as interim director of faculty development. Kate is the author of a book that you may want to include in your syllabi. It's called Interfaith Encounters in America, and more recently she co-edited a book called God in the Details, American Religion in Popular Culture. She studies and teaches in the areas of religious pluralism and gender, religion and gender, and popular culture, and recently taught a course on Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Spain as a visiting professor at Universidad Rey Juan Carlos Madrid. Rahuldeep will then give us his comments. Dr. Rahuldeep Gill is Associate Professor of Religion here at California Lutheran, where he also directs the Center for Equality and Justice, and if you want an awesome title, he's also the campus interfaith strategist. So go back to your campus, say Cal Lutheran has a campus interfaith strategist. I would like to be that. He's also the visiting professor of Sikh studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and he regularly speaks and writes about interfaith topics for business and higher education leaders. And I've also heard a rumor that on his sabbatical, he might be working on a book that you will also want to include in future syllabi. So you can ask him about that. Now the pressure's on, Rahuldeep. Dr. Barbara McGraw is professor of social ethics, law, and public life at St. Mary's College of California, where she also directs the Center for Engaged Religious Pluralism and the Program for Interfaith Leadership in the School of Economics and Business. Barbara is the author of a book that Shireen on our student panel yesterday mentioned as one of the ones that was most influential in her coursework on interfaith studies. She's co-author of of America's Sacred Ground, Public Religion and Pursuit of the Good in a Pluralistic America, and then also co-author of one of the most used world religion textbooks in the US, Many Peoples, Many Faith, Women and Men in the World Religions. And lastly, Dr. Ibu Patel is the founder and president of IFYC. He has his PhD from the University of Oxford and regularly speaks on college campuses and in the media about interfaith cooperation and understanding. He's written several books, including Acts of Faith, Sacred Ground, and also has a book forthcoming this summer, I believe, called Interfaith Leadership, a Primer, which would also have a great place on your syllabi. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kate.
Thank you. What a gift to be here with all of you. Thank you. As you're going to see in my comments, and I've put a few slides together, my environment does not always welcome conversations like this, so this really is a gift for me, and I'm already much richer for having been here. So I'd like to share a little bit about my experience in working on putting together an interreligious relations certificate program at our university, which is still in progress. We're not approved yet. We're in the incredibly labyrinthine process of getting that approved right now. And having heard some of the comments yesterday, I want to reel it back and make all kinds of changes, but it'll be what it'll be. So I want to share some insights from our experience, and I hope also to raise some questions on a more theoretical level about particularly the relationship between this emerging field and the mostly well-established discipline of religious studies. So I teach at Chico State, which is part of a 23 campus system. It's a very large state. We're up there, not quite the northernmost campus, but close at the top of the Sacramento Valley. And our students are actually quite secular. You know, Pew tells us that 1 in 5, approaching 1 in 4 Americans are not religiously affiliated. That's higher among young people and higher in the West. So we deal with a significantly secular population, and that has to inform the work that we do. So interreligious studies, whatever it's going to look like, has to account for them and for the flexible and dynamic religious identities, hybrid identities that are more and more characterizing our population. But I've listed there a list of some of the programs that are related or potentially related to an initiative like this, and I wonder if you can guess who are the most and least supportive on that list. The least support came from my colleagues in the Department of Comparative Religion and Humanities. I've gotten the greatest support from Multicultural and Gender Studies and the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and First-Year Experience. So why is that? It's a tricky problem. I think it's a kind of a wall of separation of a kind we don't necessarily have fully theorized yet. But we hear this language all the time about the academic study of religion versus the faith-based practice of religion, et cetera. And religious studies obviously grew out of theological studies, and I don't think that differentiation is really totally complete yet. And so there's still a lot of anxiety about the Christian origins of religious studies, and that can lead our colleagues in the field to try to out-science the scientists in their neutrality, even to the point of wanting to treat our topic as some kind of lab specimen. But I don't think it has to be that way, and I think interreligious studies opens up a way to maybe do it slightly differently. I think at its best, religious studies, the insistence on the religious studies approach is an insistence on inclusion. So when I last week had students in my Introduction to Religion class building a world religions timeline, and one of them wanted to include incarnation of Christ, and I suggested maybe you'd want to use birth of Jesus instead. The purpose of that language, that's a religious studies move, right? And the purpose of that language is not to discount the faith commitment of the student, but to express the historical event in a way that's inclusive of everybody. So in that sense, I don't want this field to become divorced from religious studies, because I think religious studies has important commitments that speak to the heart of what interfaith studies might be. So in fact, we do make normative claims in public universities. So in building our interreligious studies program, we drew not from any kind of claims that could be identified as theological, but rather on claims that come directly from our university mission, which includes language like multicultural respect, pursuing diversity as a community, and then from our departmental program goals, cultivating understanding and respect for religious diversity and non-religious perspectives as an integral part of education for citizenship in a pluralistic society and world. So these are the convictions that we can build a program on. And so this language of civics and pluralism and diversity and inclusion have become our watchwords. So in our certificate program proposal, which is currently in review process, you'll see that we have highlighted these civic and also pre-professional kinds of outcomes. Our undergraduate certificate program will equip students in a variety of programs with value-added competencies. That's a buzzword on our campus. We love competencies. Suitable to a range of professional activities involving religiously diverse populations. And then we clarified the relationship with religious studies programs that already exist on campus by suggesting that the distinctive features of this certificate are its sustained attention to the interactions between different religious and non-religious groups and the multidisciplinary and practical focus. So these are the actual learning outcomes, objectives that we have built into the program. And you can see how we have sort of, I think these are similar to the kinds of things that are being developed in programs all over the country, but you can see the kinds of framing language that we've used, embedding reference to non-religious identities as well, making that a very clear part of the diversity package, and highlighting the embeddedness of religious identities in other forms of cultural, in other cultural systems. So I think I can summarize the ways we've tried to make the case for including interreligious studies in a public setting in these 4 ways. We've made, I think pretty compellingly, the diversity and civic engagement argument, and in fact we are including in our required senior internship program, we're including a unit on teaching students how to sell this capacity as they move into the professional world, how to market themselves as competent in multireligious understanding. There's also the pragmatic humanities argument. I think we're looking for arguments all over the place in the humanities for how to defend our disciplines in an increasingly commodified educational world. So this is a way that we can talk about the actual pragmatic value of our programs, but I think that we have to be so careful about not reducing this to a commodity that attaches to the student's degree. And I don't know yet how to find that narrow space. I think that's a challenge that we're still working on. The interdisciplinary argument, which is also a very strategic argument, because as we've built these cross-campus partnerships, we're discovering that those strengthen our religious studies program, which will house this certificate program, because now we've got students in many different majors, ultimately, we hope, embedded in this program. So when somebody's looking to chop programs on campus, it will be more difficult to do this program that's so entangled with other majors. And then, of course, the if we build it, they might come argument. My secret hope is that this is going to be the saving of religious studies, which has seen, at least in our program, a decline in majors over the past decade or so. I really believe this could be a kind of future for religious studies, marking its coming of age in relation to theology, sort of coming back to those normative conversations and those pragmatic, service-oriented activities, but in a way that is consistent with the best practices that have emerged in religious studies. Very briefly then, a few lessons that we've learned over the course of it. Start with relationships, not with programs or proposals. Oh my gosh, I'm way over my time. Sorry, let me jump ahead then. I think the most important lesson we learned was to leverage our existing initiatives on campus. We looked around and said, where is campus energy invested right now? And the answer was in our first-year experience program, in project-based learning, in civic engagement, and in our new Hispanic serving institution status. So guess what? We worked all of that into our proposal for a certificate in religious studies. And the piece of that I'm most proud of is this course that we're going to be piloting next fall, where we have merged our Introduction to Religion class with a required American government class that's taken by a cohort of first-generation students. So we'll have 100 students in a 6-unit blended course that is completely project-based, and the project they're going to be working on is the meaning of religious identity in civic society. And so we're partnering with the local Interfaith Council in quite an elaborate project that I'd be happy to share more information about, but I'm way over time, so thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to start my timer, too. I hope you see that there's going to be a lot of differences between us as much as everything resonates. For one, I would love to commodify interfaith studies on my student's degree. I'll commodify the heck out of that. As I was preparing for this, I was thinking about James Fallows' essay in the last month's Atlantic, which he's one of my favorite authors. He's been away for a couple years in China, or apparently he's been traveling around the country in like a Cessna or something. And I was gripped with anxiety reading his essay, because he talks about all these things that we don't realize about America and how America has changed, including in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a huge pig slaughterhouse that is at the center of the South Dakota, the Sioux Falls downtown landscape, where the workers on the line cutting up pig carcasses include Muslim women from Sudan and Somalia, saving money to send their children to college. And the reason this gripped me with anxiety is I spent my time in my office reading books. I have no idea about Sudanese and Somali women cutting up pig carcasses and the changing landscape of religion that is, right, the American horizon. in some sense, I am the least qualified person to try to put together an interfaith studies curriculum, right? My PhD, in some sense, should disqualify me because I'm in the books, right? But what is my saving grace? For me at Cal Lutheran, I think the saving grace is are my students. The value added that civic and interfaith cooperation has brought to our life at Cal Lutheran is, I don't want to say immeasurable because we do want to measure it, but it's intense, it's immense, it's awesome. Faith is not higher ed institutions are not the most faith-friendly, right, institutions, whether they're public or even, right, sometimes when they're confessional contexts like ours. So interfaith cooperation has carved out faith-friendly spaces on our campus, and that includes spaces for students who are secular, right, who are non-affiliated, who are atheistic, who are seeking, all of those things. Another value added that the co-curricular aspect of interfaith work on our campus has done is that it has created new modes of leadership among our student population here. So there are several times where I've heard from student groups, well, we should do that like the Interfaith Allies are doing. You know, when they bring out the rug and they invite people to come and talk, we need to work on that. Or we should go talk to those interfaith people and see how they ... So there's an immense value added to our campus because of interfaith cooperation. On our campus at Cal Lutheran, it emerges out of a co-curricular commitment. That's how we started. We were professors, right, Colleen Wyndham Hughes and I, working with students on programming. So as we are working on bringing that into the classroom, I think it's very important for us to leverage the value added that the co-curricular is bringing to our campus. I think there's 3 core competencies that we can brag about right now that we're already bringing to students. And the first one is a very liberal arts, very humanities oriented core competency, which all of our majors should boast. That is the ability to navigate and communicate complexity, right? We should all be able to do that. So that's the core competency 1. Our students should be able to do that. But core competency 2 brings that to life in ways that it doesn't in most other humanities contexts. And core competency 2 for me is a bias towards action. Our students in interfaith studies are, as co-curricular participants and should be, normatively, be biased towards action. Now, for me, as a teacher in the classroom, this is the hardest one to do because my bias towards action is to write a paper about something that really pisses me off, right? Fine. So one way that we can incorporate that is bias them to action, narrating their own spiritual autobiographies, which is something that I have my students do. My student Toby is here. He's reading Acts of Faith right now. He's going to put a second draft of his spiritual autobiography together after he's done reading Acts of Faith. Colleen Wyndham Hughes biases her students towards action by having them write for public audiences. So we are deeply involved here with the op-ed project at Cal Lutheran, and we're having our students write in op-ed fashion, right? So writing as action. Another way that this tension between the liberal arts desire for complexity and this bias towards action is resolved for us, though, is leaning on the co-curricular aspect that we've built, right? So students are taking classroom learning and adding more value to the college campus by enacting the learning and by making this, right, a faith-friendly place, a place of experimentation, which is, for me, core competency number 3, a commitment to radical experimentation. Again, another tension with our liberal arts, humanities, PhD, right? For us, experimentation is like, I might add gender in this dynamic here, right? It's like, but for our students who are programming, they need to be inherently entrepreneurial in what they're doing. So they are building programs, they are hopefully measuring and assessing how they go, and then deciding whether in the next round to persevere with their MO or pivot to new ways. The second two core competencies have a lot to teach us, I think, as academics, right? The bias towards action and the radical experimentation. And indeed, enacting all three is vital for us as the teachers and as the putter-togethers of these interfaith curricula. Yeah, I guess we can talk about most of the other stuff in the question and answer, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Raldeep.
Thanks. I'm going to start my timer. Well, I'm really honored to be here and humbled by some of the conversations I've had with some of you already. So it's been really exciting so far and look forward to more. But I'll get right to it. I'm at a liberal arts college that is Catholic-based. And so just like Kate, tying into the mission has been really important. And I'm very fortunate that St. Mary's College has a commitment to civic and community engagement that all students in the core curriculum have to take a course that has community engagement in it. So that activism part is really critical. And also a commitment to social justice and inclusive community. And then, as you can see from the handout that I had sent around, we're actually, our program, which I'll talk a little bit about more here, is housed in the School of Economics and Business. And it was widely accepted there, unanimous approval throughout, no pushback at all. The catchline for our program that sums up our mission is in the School of Economics and Business is think globally, lead responsibly. And so you can see that interfaith leadership is obviously a part of that. So we often say with our program that we put the leadership in interfaith leadership. So that's our way of getting at it. I come from a scholar activist background. So I was already working with prison chaplains on religious diversity issues before I went, or I guess it was just as I was starting my PhD program. So I see scholarship and activism out in the world as inherently linked for me and for a lot of other people, beyond that kind of public intellectual thing that sometimes people call activism. I mean, really getting out there and getting your hands dirty. And so because I come from that perspective, the interdisciplinary nature of this area was just obvious to me right from the beginning. I've been working with prison chaplains on a joint program with the AAR, my Center for Engaged Religious Pluralism, for a number of years, and watching them transform from a kind of narrow idea of what is needed for them to understand what they're doing in a religiously diverse situation really led me to an understanding of kind of what I think some of you are also doing as well, is thinking about these learning outcomes in a pretty broad and interdisciplinary way. So I've been thinking about this sort of thing for a long time. I'm interdisciplinary myself because I have a legal background, I have a religious studies degree, and also in social ethics. My degree is religion and social ethics, and I do a lot of religion and politics work. And so I'm interdisciplinary. Plus, I used to be in the business world. I like to say that I helped put America into junk bond debt in the late 1980s when I was a corporate finance attorney. So I put all this together. So let me just get right to some things on the handout that I gave you. So first of all, 3 purposes for interfaith leadership in business and the professions. This was really very easy to get people to understand in the professional realm, and I can talk a little bit later about how we wended our way through the process with campus and all of that, but I just want to get to these core competencies. So it's really obvious to people in the business world and also professionally as well. how important it is to be able to build inclusive teams for cooperative and effective action. And so it's really important for the workplace, but it really goes beyond that. It's about leveraging difference for multi-perspectival approaches to identify and achieving beneficial goals. So it's not just how can we make everyone cooperative to do the thing we want to do, but how can we understand the different perspectives that people bring to the table for how we might organize ourselves differently, how we might be more effective, how we might identify goals for our business or professional activities, and ultimately to contribute to creating a more cooperative, safer, and harmonious world through these endeavors. So I spoke at the Parliament of World Religions about interfaith leadership in business, and Vandana Shiva was there, of course, and saw her speak, and she said, we need to overthrow our corporate overlords. And I've been speaking to people in the Silicon Valley, and they actually want to see themselves as contributing to making a better world. So really what we ought to be doing is helping them to transform and expanding the possibilities. And when I talk to them about this, and when I teach interfaith leadership in the MBA program, on Transglobal MBA program, they are as jazzed and as excited as your students are about this field. They think it's the cutting edge. This is what we need. An Apple executive said, I wish I had had this when I was doing my programming. And so we don't need to overthrow our corporate overlords. We just need to help them do the work that they really want to do. They want to feel like they're making a contribution to the world too. And they really see this work as contributing to that. So I want to also talk about the new skills and understandings across disciplines that are needed to do this work. A lot of times people focus on religious literacy and understanding, which of course is critical. But it's not as important that they understand a whole lot about a lot of different religions. What's more important is they understand what religious literacy is, so that they think about what the appropriate questions to ask, or even that their questions might be biased, and think about what kinds of questions and ways of being open to questions and what that's all about. Because I can tell you that when you get out there, as we know, as those of you doing this work know, there's a lot more out there than like 5 or 6 religions that people tend to focus on. So just by way of an example, a few years ago, the prison chaplains in our program said, wow, there's these inmates, they want to practice something called Messianic Judaism, and they thought the inmates were making it up. So I brought the experts in that area, who are also practitioners, and you could have seen their jaws drop. And also, like you think about the military with the Yazidis, right, being attacked by ISIS. Well, you're not going to learn that in a religious studies class, but what you could learn is what do I need to know so that I don't save those people in a way that they don't want to live after we're done saving their bodies, right? So that's why this work is so important. So just quickly, want to just talk a little bit about, critical to this is identity formation understanding, bias understanding. These two things we have in our program together, and to understand that we all look at the world through a lens, and then trying to learn as much as we possibly can, what would it be like to look through someone else's eyes at a problem? And I find that students are really open to that. And communication dialogue skills combined with intercultural understanding is really critical as well. And a lot of people think of religious studies or investigating religion as a subset of intercultural. I actually think it's the other way around. If you look deeply at any culture in the world, whether it's national or regional, you will find deep religious values at the core, just like there is here in the United States. There's a reason we're workaholics. We're all Calvinists, even if we think we're secular. And that's true other places as well. And so you dig down and you find out that it's not just some cultures are communitarian and some are individualistic. There's all this depth that comes out of understanding religion. Lastly, leadership skills and understanding. Like I said, we put the leadership in interfaith leadership to be able to promote cooperation, resolve conflict, and be effective in creating institutional and social change. And this really came out of this prison work through the years that I've done, because it isn't just that the chaplains need to understand what's going on, but they need how to show leadership to bring it into their institutional settings and to be able to speak truth to power and all of that stuff as well. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there, but I look forward to more conversations with you.
Good morning, friends. A huge thank you to Cal Lutheran and to the IFYC staff for putting this all together, and to all of you for coming. A huge thank you. So there is a great Mexican cantina on the Pacific Coast Highway between LAX and here, and I stopped there last night, and the seafood soup was out of this world, but I think it potentially gave me a mild case of food poisoning. No. So I am going to do my best to make it through the next 6
Should I move
minutes.
over?
No.
Okay.
But I am making future plans, which might happen quickly. So I'm just warning you that I might politely excuse myself in a minute or two. But I have been, the best temporary cure for food poisoning is intellectual stimulation, which I've appreciated over the last 20 minutes. So I want to pick up on a couple of themes. Number one of the ways that this came kind of to the fore at IFYC is 6 or 8 or 10 years ago when we were hiring folks, we would see people who had marked on their CVs curricular work in Interfaith. And when we interviewed them, we realized that there was frankly very little overlap between what any of them did. They just all called it Interfaith. So people who were part of spiritual journey co-curricular groups said they had done and might have done an independent study around those, called it Interfaith. People who had studied Arabic and Hebrew called it Interfaith. People who had taken a course on the Middle East conflict called it Interfaith. And one of the questions we started to ask is, clearly the term interfaith is being used in a wide variety of ways as it connects to academic and curricular matters. Ought it be more tightly defined? You would probably not have a sociology major who has not read Max Weber and Durkheim. You would probably not have a sociology major who at least at some point could not have told you the difference between mean, mode, and median, right? There is a relatively defined knowledge base. There is something of a core canon to the discipline of sociology. You could argue that it's highly interdisciplinary, highly multi-methodological, et cetera, but over the course of 100 or 120 years, it's developed something of a core canon. There's a range of other fields or disciplines in which if you hire somebody out of, let's say, engineering or nursing or teaching, you expect them to be able to do certain things. They have a particular skill set. So in this kind of world of the academy, where when you major in something, it signals either a knowledge base or a skill set or both. I have read these things, I have mastered these concepts, I can do these things. If we're going to use the term interfaith in the academy, ought it attach to these two pretty foundational academic notions, what you know and what you can do. I want to begin with that. I want to move to Rahul Deep's example of the Fallows article and Somali and Sudanese women in a meatpacking factory. This is not going to help my stomach condition, by the way. So there are cases of this now. New York Times, articles on meatpacking factories and Muslim workers in Wisconsin, in Nebraska, and Colorado. And they're not in Denver and Milwaukee. They're in like out of the way rural places, right? So here's an interesting question. If you were called in by the CEO of Swift and Company, which is a major meatpacking company, and said, can you advise us on how to run a meatpacking factory with all of its required alignments and staffing when a third of our workers insist that they pray on time and their prayer schedule shifts a couple minutes a day, every day, right? Because of the calendar they follow. And oh, by the way, there's this thing called Ramadan. What advice do you give? Right? And if your student could potentially be the engineer putting that factory together, what knowledge and skills would that student need to have to be able to do that? Right, so two things. Number one, in the academy, when you study something, it often comes with what do you know and what can you do? Number two, in our civil society, of which a segment is a professional world in which people get employment, the question, I think, at the heart of interfaith studies, which is, what are the implications of people who orient around religion differently interacting with greater frequency and intensity? Are there programs that we can put together in the academy that help develop an expertise or give graduates purchase on moving this in a healthier direction? That could be a healthier direction in a place in which there's no payment, could be a healthier direction in a place where there is payment, right? Which is to say, in a PTA, kind of like a classic civil society entity, you can imagine a squabble over a school play. Should one of my colleagues is in the room who talked about a play, American Idiot by Green Day. I see him in the back there. So what if your school decides to do American Idiot by Green Day and a bunch of students want to do it and it's offensive to some religious students? And there's a squabble that breaks out in the PTA about this. One would think that somebody who has a minor in interfaith leadership would be able to help facilitate that to a healthier end. What if the foreman of a meatpacking plant is trying to figure out how to align her workers? One would think that a minor in interfaith studies would help that person have the knowledge and skills to address the situation and move it to a healthier end. By healthy, I mean a situation in which people's identities are respected, there are relationships between different parties, and there's a commitment to the common good. I want to end with Kate's point, and also Barbara's, about the fact that there are people opposed to this and why that's the case. I mean, frankly, it's not territory that we feel terribly comfortable entering into at IFYC because we're not within the academy, right? But at the end of the day, facts are facts, and it's an interesting question to ask. Where is this being welcomed and why? And where is it being opposed and why? I think that is not an unreasonable, it's an interesting thing to put on the table for the practical reason of what does it mean to start these programs, number one, and number two, what questions does it raise at a more abstract level about the future of particular disciplines? I'm going to take 5.
Thank you, Ibu. I think we'll take about 15 minutes for discussion amongst us, and then we're going to open it up so we have a good half an hour for discussion with the group. I want to pick up on that last question, and also Ibu's question about should we be thinking about the codification or the canonization of interfaith studies? Are we to the point where we can start to think about that? I was struck by how each of you spoke about the civic implication and the civic value of interfaith studies, and yet the competencies that you identified were still very different. So is there value in having some sort of unity? Even if you study Weber and Durkheim in your sociology degree, you're studying it in different ways based on who is teaching those, how you're engaging with those texts. So I think it's almost, for me, a question of a forward-looking question of what it looks like for interfaith studies to continue to cohere, to gain ground. Do we need things to be codified in some sort of particular way? How might that happen? And what are some tensions that we see in trying to do that kind of work? And if you have questions for one another, too, in your responses, feel free to raise those as well.
I think it's too soon. It's way too soon. I don't think sociologists got together at conferences and said, we got to get Max's book more, we got to bump it on Amazon or something. You know what I mean? Like, it organically emerged that was a good way to think about XYZ, right? Same with Durkheim. Maybe they did. Maybe there were secret societies that were, I don't know. If you had told me, 4 years ago when we had sent our first coterie of students to Philadelphia for their ILI, that this weekend, the first alumna who went to that was going to come back and tell me that she now works for Lloyd's Register, an organization that does quality standards control, and that she was going to say that she used voice, engage, act in her job interview, and, right, is using it in her company's pursuit of continuing improvement initiatives as a way to listen to people on the floor, as a way to have their voices emerge, as a way to engage difference. If you had told me that was the outcome, that was coming, I would not have believed it. So I don't think I am at a place where I can start saying, we're putting this into the cement right here. I am very much, and maybe it's different for the two of you, I am very much at a lean startup stage of interfaith studies.
I agree. It is early, and I'm interested in just kind of observing how it plays out. But disciplines have their sort of cultural identity. Like, an anthropology department has a certain feel. And a history department has a certain. So I wonder what the culture of interfaith studies will end up being, and I wonder if we might end up taking a page from ethnic and women's studies, which found a way into the academy, but never let go of the activist orientation that was at their inception. They had a vision of racial and gender justice that sort of drives it. And there's a price to be paid for that. They're often very marginal programs. They're often the first to be cut. But they're also the places, at least on my campus, where some of the most exciting student experiences occur, where students get to ask questions and talk about things that don't seem to find a place in any other classroom, and where faculty have a different kind of relationship with students than they do in other settings. So that might be a model. I don't know. A question for me is whether interfaith studies and interreligious studies will ultimately cohere as a single thing.
Interreligious studies or religious studies?
Even interreligious studies, as we're framing it on our campus. I think it's the same thing, but the language is so fraught that I don't know how those maybe it will cease to be so, but right now, I could make absolutely no traction with the word faith on my campus.
So I'd like to concur with the panelists that I think it's too early, but I'd also like to think about it in terms of what is the goal, what is the context that you're in, because I think the kinds of things that you might choose right now to be the things that you're working with, for your interim canon in whatever field you're in would be different depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Are you raising awareness? is it very applied the way that our program is and in the way that Ibu was talking about it? And so I think the context will matter in terms of what becomes kind of commonly used text. I also think we're in a, I think it's pretty obvious we're in a different world. Scholarship is much more fluid. When somebody wrote a major book, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, or whatever, everyone read that. Now there's lots of amazing things online and books and electronic and this, that, and the other thing. And I wonder if it'll even be possible to have a canon as much as it would be like places, directions to go, and multi-resources, etc. And I'd also like to say, to try to answer Ibu's question about, what competencies would someone have if they needed to solve this or that religion issue. And I know I said my program is in the School of Economics and Business, but I've done this prison work, and I don't want anyone to think that business is like prison, but for some people, I guess it is. When I was working in the legal field, we used to say we had the golden handcuffs, because paid a lot of money to do all kinds of things that maybe wanted to be doing something else. But in any event, the prison work is such a laboratory for the rest of the world. These folks have been dealing with religious diversity issues, and this is also in the military as well, and governmental institutions just generally, for a very long time. And their world is massively religiously diverse. Our last conference, they were trying to figure out if and how they might accommodate dudism. Now, those of you who've seen the movie The Big Lebowski, that's what it comes from, but apparently there's people who practice it. And we had people from new religious movements come and dialogue with the prison chaplains and the people who oversee the prison chaplains, and they said, well, actually it is based in Taoism. And so there is something, I hate this word, but legitimate about that, and there are people on the outside who practice it. And so they're way beyond how do we have factory operations when Muslims need to pray. They work it out through conversation. It isn't like there's this solution for this problem, and that's why the communication dialogue piece is so important, and leadership around how we might get the powers that be to understand how these things actually might be important to the constituents that you have, and that maybe a solution in one factory, if we're using that as an example, might not be the same solution that somebody comes up with in another place. And so that this whole area is really alive with lots of perspectives, understandings, creating awareness, and bringing people together to say, well, how will we make this happen? And then through this process, you create awareness, you create more harmony with the people there, et cetera. And I could go on forever, but I'll leave it there for now.
I think that's really a great way to think about it. I think we don't need to think about a canon of great books, but maybe a canon of concerns. And I think we have common concerns that we're dealing with. It's not, right, can you speak Hebrew and Arabic, right? That's not what we're doing, but why would you? And I think that the concern there is, I think the word civic is thrown a lot in interfaith studies, but I think that is a central concern. The civic well-being of the context that we're training our students for. The thing is, we don't know what those contexts are going to be, so we're doing our best to, again, experiment and hope that we're doing something right. But our concerns often are that we have, in the academy, not biases towards action, and then sometimes people in our departments, or luckily not mine, who are antithetical to the goals. So maybe that's where we're starting right now, is that we have concerns for what we want our students to do, and the concerns about the academic context that we inhabit currently as we're walking down that path.
Great. Well, so let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Can we check on Ibu? Is he okay? Do we need to pray for him? We're in the chapel, so.
I bet someone has checked on him.
Thank
yes,
you.
yes. I'm getting a nod that he's doing okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raldi. Feel free to offer prayers, though, at any point. Yeah, so let's raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Do you all want to get a couple of questions first and then respond to them, or you want to respond to questions one at a time?
Let's get like 2 or 3.
Yeah, so let's take 2 or 3 questions. We'll have some discussion, and then we'll take a couple more questions. So, Bonnie, thank you.
Yeah, hi,
Please
I'm Bonnie
introduce yourself.
Glass-Coffin. I'm at Utah State University, so another one of those public universities facing our interesting and unique challenges that maybe are not so interesting and unique. But one of the things that I really appreciated what Robbie said about this suggestion about figuring out where the core concerns are.
I like that.
And I guess just a comment or something for us to consider is this question that Ibu raised, and I know I've been dealing with, where you have the pushback coming from within the academy, from the faculty, from the folks who are saying this isn't really what we want to be doing with our students. Whereas you have the students and the people in the community going, yes, this is what we need to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are we doing to address that? Or how can we add that particular polemic to the conversation?
Great. Let's get at least one more question.
Hi, Laura Brecky from Santa Clara University.
I'd
I'm
like
not
to ask everyone to speak up, even though I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing.
Sure. Is this better? Yes? Okay, Laura Brecky, Santa Clara University. I'm not an academic. I'm actually in campus ministry. I'm the director of religious diversity, and I'm trained as a clergy person. Some of you brought up the co-curricular piece, and that's what I do, and that's why I'm here. How would you want to, if you have a campus ministry or an office for spiritual life, I know that some of those are cropping up on public universities, how would you be engaging with those of us that are trained to only do the co-curricular piece, and how would you frame those partnerships going forward alongside what you're doing in the classroom?
I think those questions go nicely hand in hand. So let's pause there. So first the question about what do we do when we find pushback within the academy, especially when there's a lot of energy, maybe from students in particular, from staff, from co-curricular folks, and also some faculty. And then also the question of what does it look like to partner well with our co-curricular partners who are often thinking about this work from a student life perspective.
I'll speak to the first one. I think there is that pushback, but I suspect that, when I actually engage in those conversations with my colleagues, they share the same concerns. They're pluralists. They want students to develop a pluralist approach to religious difference. So I think the barriers are historic and linguistic and cultural. And on our campus, the moment there's a seizable moment around civic engagement. We're just rewriting our strategic plan to include a new strategic priority around civic engagement, and that's going to be the way we make that bridge between community and student demand for very responsive programming and academic resistance to it. So for us, it's about finding those partners in the community where these are live questions and making clear what we can do to respond to them.
Yeah, for me, another way to put that same thing is to frame it around the word because. So at Cal Lutheran, we have really intentionally shifted from we do interfaith cooperation in spite of being Lutheran to we do interfaith cooperation because we're Lutheran. And I am a little bit befuddled by the inability or the lack of traction that the because is getting at public institutions. Of course we do interfaith cooperation because we're public institutions. Can we tell stories? Why? Can we articulate why? Like what is it there that is harder to do than to do at sort of a parochial religious context than in the public sphere, when the entire operation is revolving around civic engagement? We're not spiritualizing students, right? We're talking about civic engagement front and center all the time. So I would love to have more conversations with people at public institutions and maybe share like common stories of this is what we went through. Now you've got to translate this in a different context, but I think the fulcrum is the because. As far as the co-curricular aspect, my brother Scott Silverman is here. He's the assistant dean of students. When I talk to Scott about interfaith cooperation, I'm not saying, Scott, this is what I want you to do. We're saying, Scott, what are you doing? Here's what we do. Here's what it looks like. Don't let the words scare you away. Right? Here's our mission. Where does it fit in with yours? Community service, okay. Can we do community service in a way that students can articulate the deep values out of which the service that they're doing come to the fore, either before the service or after the service or during it, right? So that's how I love to approach the issue of partnering with the co-curricular things. That the gap between academic affairs and student affairs, though, is real. As much as I wish it wasn't, it is. Luckily for me, my provost is in the room today and my assistant dean of students is in the room today, and their commitment to interfaith cooperation is nonpareil. Like that is just amazing. But I think the common goals, aligning the common goals is the way to go.
So I'm at a faith-based institution, so I don't have the issue of the public institution, but I think something about the way that we approached getting started might be helpful, and that is we started by making sure that the powers that be were on our side through lots of conversations and so forth. But then what we did was we didn't go specifically to religious studies and say, what do you think of this? Or specific people that we thought it might work with or anything like that. We just put out a call. We got this little grant from the Interfaith Youth Corps and the Teagle Foundation. We're going to have an all-day retreat. Anyone, and this is what it's about, and saying what the common concerns were and how it was related to our mission and civic engagement and so forth and so on, and we invited everyone. And who showed up? People across the disciplines. So it wasn't a surprise then when we put the program together that we had people from business management, communication, global and regional studies, politics, ethnic studies, religious studies, history, anthropology, and kinesiology. The kinesiology chair said to me, we absolutely must have this because they do health sciences, right? What took you so long? And so what we did was we started developing the program those who came. So there wasn't any pushback from those folks, right? And then we just kept inviting everyone the entire time. So when we were at the end of our program and we had pushback, met with those folks, heard their concerns, and I just said, wow, those were some great ideas. I wish you'd been involved in the conversation as we went along, because the program might have looked a little different if you'd been participating. And we'll keep it in mind going forward. But in so many words or less, the train left the station and they didn't get on. So they didn't have much that they could say about it in the end. So that's a little bit about our how-to approach to making it happen.
One of the things that I'm hearing from all of you that I think connects back to Ibu's comments and some of the things that we spoke about earlier is if we're not yet in a place where we can start to name core competencies, define clearly the shape of the field, which I think for good reasons, that makes a lot of sense. We are in a place where we can start thinking about how to articulate and communicate clearly what the work that we are doing is to our colleagues. And I think that I really loved what you all said about sometimes you just need to have that conversation. I'm going to put Raul Deep on the spot, but do you remember the very first conversation we ever had, Raul Deep? You came up to me at the ILI and you were like, I totally believe in interfaith as a personal commitment. It's not something that can happen in the classroom. And I was like, okay, we're going to talk more. And
I never said that.
I would like to say I converted you.
I think you're misremembering.
Oh no, oh no, oh no.
Look, okay, maybe I said something like that. In my first year when I was teaching a course called Introduction to the Study of Global Religions, which I loved how it was titled. I inherited that title, but I hated teaching it because it still came down to world religions.
Yeah.
And my colleague Rosa Slan and I, when I got my second global religions colleague, we were like, yeah, we're done with this course. But in that first coterie of students in fall 2009 that I had, one was the daughter of an ELCA pastor, and she was struggling throughout the course. At the end of the course, during finals week, she just came up to me and said, Dr. Gill, I just wanted to say thank you. You've made my faith stronger. And me, I was green out of grad school, UC Santa Barbara, secular religious studies, right? I was like, get the hell out of here. Like, what are you talking about? That is not what I'm trying to do. But, grayer now that I am and wiser, I understand what she meant by that. And so it's my students, right? A year, like, when I was doing the Theories of Religion series at UC Santa Barbara, if you had told me that that's what my position was going to be, I was also going to say, no way, but we change as the context in which we are changes, and that's why, for me, experimentation and openness is actually, for us, a core competency as leaders in this field.
I totally agree with that. That is really critical.
Yeah. So just to emphasize, I think what I'm hearing from you all is this work that we are doing to articulate how this makes sense in our context, articulating what we're doing with our colleagues, and also maybe with our co-curricular colleagues, but also our colleagues within our disciplines or within the faculty, to help make sense of what interfaith studies is, why it's valuable, and how it resonates and makes sense within our own particular context and isn't something that needs to be threatening or challenging. And Kate, I love what you said. Sometimes those conversations were actually easier than I expected them to be, and that is something that I will say, and Noah might echo this as well. We've spent a lot of time in conversations with the different grantees about the progress of their work, and that's something that I've heard again and again. There was this person who seemed very resistant to it, and then we sat down and we had a conversation about what I think we're trying to do and how we can do that together and how it might not be threatening, and those conversations have been very productive and generative. Let's take some more questions. Over there?
Reese Potterville at the Graduate Theological Union. Rahadeep mentioned the student that maybe 3 or 4 years out it had contact with, giving feedback about how student learning outcomes suddenly were integrated into our current vocational setting and context. And it made me think how important it will be for these fledgling programs and emphases to be able to track out 5 and 10 years to see whether the competencies and skills that we're trying to inculcate do pop up in wonderful ways and make these individuals contribute differently to the world and to their own vocational environment. So I'm wondering, if you have any special ways of tracking that systematically, and whether there's any I'll just say more like a national effort to draw information like that together over the next 10 years, because I think that might help shape the way that this sort of movement emerges and changes and morphs.
Can I just say how excited I am that graduate institutions are here and concerned about interfaith studies? And I just wanted to give a round shout out to all the graduate, somebody from Hebrew College is here, all kinds of people. The president of the Graduate Theological Union is here. That is massive, right? We're talking about interfaith studies, but we're not just talking about the undergraduate context. I mean, that's just an amazing pivot for me. But should we take more questions before?
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. There was a question up in the front. Esther? There. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. My name's Kathleen Moore, and I'm chair of the Religious Studies program department at UC Santa Barbara. very proud to have had any role in the formation of Rahul Deep's thinking, and Colleen Wyndham Hughes as well. So I want to thank you both. This is very important. And it cannot be emphasized too much that, you know, church-based schools and public universities are operating in different worlds when it comes to this. But what I wanted to say is we do co-curricular planning through a multicultural center, and some of the things Kate had mentioned before about gravitating toward initiatives on campus where, you know, there's a lot of energy. The Multicultural Center does our religious literacy programming, and not in coordination with the Department of Religious Studies for various reasons that are institutional. But I want to say that they are offering religious literacy programming through an anti-oppressive framework. But there are many out there who think that religion is, you know, an oppressor. So that's what we have to work with, in part, is to try to overcome some of the barriers that keep the academic and the co-curricular apart for those reasons. I wonder if you can address that in terms of seeing religion as being part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
And then there was a question up in the front row. Could you raise your hand, Esther, right there?
My name is Moses Penamaka. I'm on the faculty at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is part of the California Lutheran University. I want to thank the panelists and want to make a comment and raise a question out of that. In finding the core competencies, language and lens. Language, as Kate McCarthy gave an excellent example of how, you know, incarnation versus birth of Jesus, that's really important, because finding the common language which helps us look at the subject matter in a very objective way, without building any walls or any prejudice. So that is very important. And the lens. You know, I teach Asian and Oceanic cultural and faith traditions, and I learned from my students, oftentimes, consciously or unconsciously, I started teaching from a dominant Christian lens. I started teaching all these other faith traditions from a Christian lens, and the students reminded me, I think I have to be careful. I think, so in finding the core competencies, both for the faculty who teach and for the students who learn, and together, we need to give importance to the language, the vocabulary, and the lens or the hermeneutical starting point from where we look at all these that are happening. The question for us is, how do we find that language and the lens?
All right, so the three questions that I heard, all great questions, and I think you all can feel free to respond to them as you'd like. So first, what does it look like to track the outcomes and the impact of these kinds of programs long term? Secondly, how do we engage with maybe faculty peers or others who see religion as the problem, and so therefore perhaps bringing in religious identity or secular identity in the way that interfaith studies might make space for is actually seen as a real barrier? And that question came up a little bit yesterday as well too, so thanks for raising that again. And then this question about how do we develop our language and our lens that helps us understand what core competencies make the most sense in our particular context.
Can I start? We're committed to tracking our students who come through this program. We've just started doing it in religious studies, a much more concerted effort to maintain relationships with our alums to find out what they're doing and what do they say about, 5 years out, 10 years out, the impact of their religious studies degree. And so we're building that into the interreligious relations certificate. On the question of those who see religion as the enemy, I just wanted to maybe map the territory a tiny bit more finely. We have colleagues on our campus who think that the only role for a religious studies department it should be a department of religious debunking. Right? That's the proper academic approach to the subject. That's one group of people. Within the department, obviously, there's a much more appreciative understanding of religion. And there, I think the hostility or the resistance is to Christian dominance of the conversation about religion. And so, and that's why the word faith is so problematic, because it does come out of that kind of ecumenical Christian conversation. And so I think it's really two very distinct campaigns that have to be waged. And I think for for those who are hostile to the entire enterprise of the study of religion, I think the most fruitful angle is the diversity one, and that is religious people exist on our planet, and we study them. We want to understand them. So what can you say to that? This is a reality of our world that we need to understand. And we frame it in terms of diversity language. I'm not sure what the solution is to the legacy of Christian dominance of interfaith work, but I think decentering Christianity and actually decentering the traditions in general. So more and more, I think religious studies departments are getting away from courses in Islam, Buddhism, Protestant Christianity, Catholic, and doing more, religion and science, religion and gender, and kind of breaking up those monoliths. And I'm not sure quite how, but I think that's good for this emerging discipline.
You want to go? Go ahead. I wanted to talk primarily about the last question. I think the issue of the language and lens is so important. And one of the things that I've found is that using examples, using examples that open up the conversation in a way that kind of shocks the conversation. So you don't start through what's dominant and then head in, like, how can we open it up? You go way over here, and then everybody goes, what? And so I'll give you an example. St. Mary's College, the students and most of the faculty are very liberal. So I started with Kim Davis and showed how horribly she was treated and took it from that perspective. And so I had two students in my class who had lesbian mothers, very upset at first. I had rationalist secularists who were saying, oh, this is really stupid that she was even doing this, etc. And then just gradually got them to look at the whole thing through her lens. That one thing opened them up to everything else. But I do think you raise a really important issue, because we who do work on all kinds of privilege, right? We talk about gender privilege and racial privilege and all this other stuff. But if you bring up religious privilege, you get a blank stare. I was in, HR did a program on religious diversity for staff and faculty, and they were talking about privileges and so forth and so on. Religious privilege wasn't up there. And when I said, well, what about religious privilege? All the Catholics in the room went, what are you talking about? Anyway, and part of the reason for that is because of the other issue, which is that even on a faith-based campus, the Catholics don't feel entirely welcome to claim their faith and talk about it, just like others don't. And so really bringing this forward and then kind of empowering people through the kinds of things you were talking about, Rajal, about how getting people to claim their identity through the work that they're doing, and then having the multi-identities. So in my interfaith leadership class, students at the beginning, they'll say, well, I'm kind of spiritual, that whole thing that we hear, or I was raised Catholic, but, by the end of the course, even though it isn't one of my goals, they begin to claim who they are and be comfortable with one another from their different identities, rather than feeling that they have to suppress who they are to fit some sort of cultural norm, which we all know any cultural norm is oppressive in some way, right? So unless we're able to bring who we are, however we are, and have this constant kind of emerging, messy dialogue that moves forward as we're accepting of this, that, and the other thing, I don't see us coming to an understanding ever, and I hope we never do, because then all it will be is another privileged position or lens through which then everybody has to look, constantly breaking it up and opening it up. So that's enough for now, but I could do a whole lecture series on just that one topic. I think it's so important, so I'm glad you raised it.
Real deep, yeah.
My father-in-law, who's staying with us, wanted me to make sure that I wish all of you today, no matter what my lecture topic was, he didn't care, a happy Sikh New Year, because it's the first day of the Nanak Shahi calendar, so happy Sikh New Year. Before you feel too good about that, by the way, there's a lot of Sikhs who don't believe in the Nanak Shahi calendar and think it's a bunch of bunk. So that is to say, this is the complex religious environment that we live in, but still, happy New Year. One of the things that I tell Lutherans, and my friend and mentor, Bishop Hansen, is here, and he really has taught me this, is that the Reformation is never done. And Lutherans who believe that the Reformation is done, right, are what Lutheran, what kind of Lutheran are you? Religious studies, in the same way, my friends, is never done being self-reflexive. Okay? So there's a lot of insight in religious studies, and I think when I say that we are ready to teach our students about complexity, it is because the self-reflexive nature, the epistemological clarity which we strive to pursue in religious studies, we only do it halfway most of the time. And so, in my last book review, right, I have objective scholars, right, white guys, telling me that I'm speaking from an insider's voice, right? They know exactly who I am. They know Sikh studies is not a massive field, right? They know exactly what game we're playing here. And so we are only halfway done with our Reformation. We are only halfway reflexive in religious studies. Hey, we're religious studies, right? To go to Arise's point about tracking, I think a lot of people will be tracking data. I don't know, that's not very humanities. Hey, we're interdisciplinary in religious studies, right? Don't we have sociologists who can help us create ways to find data sets? Can we track qualitative measures by which people are reporting their own development? There's a bunch of things that we can do. We are sort of stuck in these parochial ways of thinking about it, and I think I like what you're saying is that we've got to explode those assumptions. And this is talking also about what Moses was saying in terms of the lens and the language. The hermeneutics of this are immense. Are we going to privilege a secular language of the birth of Jesus versus the incarnation of Christ? I don't think that's I don't think there should be clarity on that. We are religious studies. We need to know what move we are doing when we are privileging the secular over that language. Let's just be honest about that, right? We need to take the self-reflexivity up 360 degrees. And finally, I think Kathy's question about religion as the oppressor is probably the most difficult one. One, it's good news, it's immense news that your multicultural center is interested in religion. I mean, let's start with that. That's awesome news. I think the answer lies in the fact that we are religious studies. We can deal with the complexity of them seeing religion as the oppressor. I don't know how, Kathy. That's your job. I'm just saying we can do it.
I'd just like to add something to to that if I could, if that's all right? I just wanted to, one of the things I also do is show how the secular can be the oppressor. And so, again, back to the Kim Davis example, I mean, we actually, as a country, you know, put her in jail. That's pretty oppressive. That's pretty oppressive, putting someone in jail and people screaming at her. I mean, I'm not on her side in terms of who she is and what she's trying to do and so forth and so on. But I thought to myself, am I the only pluralist here that is worried about how she's being treated? And so that is one of the that example is one of the most stark of recent times of how oppressive the secular point of view can be. And then what we have is those on the secular side saying, well, we better get rid of the Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, with no understanding of how that act and its sister act, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, are transforming governmental institutions as it undermines, or I would say better word is transforms, the normative Protestant hegemony that still prevails in government institutions, that mindset. And those laws are critical to the transformation. And the secularists want to throw them out so that we can oppress right-wing Christians. We've got to open our minds to how oppressive the secular can be. And I think when you can try to get people to see that, they'll see then that religion is no more or less oppressive than, and you just use the Soviet Union as an example, pretty oppressive of people, right? And that was a secular government. So I don't know. I get very passionate about this stuff, and as you can tell, I better shut up so that Cassie can move on.
I think we're getting close to time, and like Colleen, I would like to honor the value of coffee breaks. I have a few announcements to make before we properly break. Just want to turn to the panelists and see if you have, a minute or two of closing words that you'd like to say, anything that really stuck with you from our conversation.
I think that last exchange about the secular and the religious is profoundly challenging and important for us to think about, and I don't think we're remotely close to having that sorted out about what language privileges what, and can religious studies accommodate language in which that moment on the timeline is called the incarnation of Christ. I think that's a huge challenge.
But that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, agreed.
Right? This is precisely why we're here. Can I get an amen? We're an amen. This is precisely why we're here. This is precisely the problems that as grad students we sat in the coffee shops talking about, and roll me another one. Let's think about this other thing that's, now we are in a position to do something about it, right? And this conversation is not easy. If it was easy, somebody else would have done it. So let's rely on the resources that we have through our graduate training and the resources that other colleagues have, and let's tackle the problem. We are not going to be done with these issues. We are not going to be done with these questions, but that's why it's fun.
And I would just like to say that I am so inspired by the conversations we've been having so far, the thoughtful questions, the issues that people are dealing with, and being a part of a community of scholars who are really struggling with this is just so inspiring. And I just want to thank all of you for being here. And I feel so privileged to be a part of this panel and with all of you.
Great. So let's thank our panelists, and then bear with me.